Well, normally we would be taking out the Sefer Torah at this time. Since we don't have a physical minyan here, I'll share some words of Torah with you. And let me just make sure I turn to the right page before I begin. This week's Torah portion is Vayikra. The rabbis tell us something very interesting about this week's Torah portion. This week's Torah portion is Vayikra. It's the first portion of the third book of the Torah. Third book of the Torah in Hebrew is called Vayikra, and in English it's called Leviticus. Leviticus is a more descriptive name of the entire book of its contents. I'm going to talk more about the Hebrew in a second, because it refers to Levi. The goings-on and the tasks of the Levi is actually a subset of Levi, those who are the descendants of Aaron, who were the Kohanim, the priests. Leviticus deals with cleanliness and uncleanliness. Leviticus deals with purity and impurity. Leviticus deals with Kohen, priests, Levi, Israel. It has a lot of set structure. And overall, it's not the most interesting and engaging of the 5 books of the Torah. No offense to any Kohanim in the audience that are listening. So here is what's interesting. In the Talmud, when a child becomes 5 years old, they become the age of learning the Torah. At that time, a child is to begin their education towards the Torah. And the rabbis say that study should begin with the third book of the Torah. So when a child is first introduced to this wonderful book called our Torah, the first book that they are to learn is this book, Vayikra. Now, you would think, aren't there better choices out there? Number 1 in line is probably Genesis, Bereshit. We have an amazing, colorful story with a lot of action. But more powerfully, we learn about the creation of the world and humanity's response to manage this wonderful creation that we have. Wonderful in all senses of the world, of the word. Wonderful because it's just so great. And we learn in Genesis that there's many blessings that we can receive, but we also understand that there's great responsibility for managing this powerful world that we inhabit. Wouldn't that be fitting for a child who's coming to understand this world? That they come to see that there is this beautiful world they live in, and they as a human being have to begin the journey of how to manage within this world? More powerfully, wouldn't you think that today, of all the books of the Torah we want our children to learn about, is a book that describes how nature is so strong, and sometimes nature can be out of our control, and we as human beings have to learn how to respond within the boundaries of nature. Even more powerfully, I would argue that the journey that we are experiencing today comes from that first book. As we are told to social distance ourselves and we retreat into our own individual homes. Isn't that the journey of Noah, who was told, retreat within this set space, separate yourself out from the world, because there is going to be a great natural disaster that will take place? Sadly, the story of Noah is a tragedy. And I think in understanding the story of Noah, the rabbi said, you know what? There's something that can be learned from Leviticus. Let me explain. The book of Noah, the story of Noah is a tragedy, because while Noah survives, the world and every other living human being not connected to Noah's circle is destroyed as well. And the rabbis asked the question, why was that the case? And the answer is, "Vatishachet ha'aretz lifnei ha'Elohim, vatimaleh ha'aretz chamas." The world was filled with corruption and lawlessness. Those words also mean arrogance and violence. And for the rabbis, they understood Noah as a time when humanity was filled with arrogance, an arrogance that made them feel that they did not need God, they did not need to live with other people, they could establish their own rules, that the world was just themselves. That was the arrogance. And when you have that mindset and people with the same mindset share a same space, that can only lead to violence and destruction. So when the world faced a stressful moment, humanity faced a great consequence because of our arrogance and the violence that was going on. In fact, when we study the book of Noah, or the story of Noah, we see that God slowly plants a seed. Noah is known for not rushing the creation of the ark. It's a process that takes many, many years. And yet humanity is so arrogant and so consumed with themselves that they don't realize that there is a natural disaster awaiting them, that they need to respond. So what then is the book that we can turn to that gives us guidance of how not to be arrogant? The book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus, this week's Torah portion, which in Hebrew is not Leviticus, but it's Vayikra. And the rabbis study the word Vayikra. And if you have ever seen a Torah that has this, if you've looked at the Torah and you've looked at the actual word Vayikra, you will notice that the aleph is small. And this hints at a way of looking at the book of Leviticus as a way of guiding us to live a more humble life. And I'm going to talk about three ways that the book of Leviticus, the book of Vayikra, gives us a guideline for living with humility, about embracing our personhood, about realizing our power, and also living with pause. Let's begin with personhood. The small aleph in Vayikra, the rabbis say, hints at a humility. The word Vayikra is to call, to assemble, but in an intimate way, to bring about. And Moses, when he is writing the Torah, according to rabbinic legend, struggles with this. Because why should Moses be the person that God comes to, as he is just a human being? He is no greater than anyone else in his own eyes. And therefore, he would prefer the word to be Vayikar, which is the root is kuf resh hey, not with an aleph, which means to happen, to come upon. And for Moses, he would prefer that it was just randomly that God comes to him and asks him to come to the Ohel Moed. The beauty of this understanding is that Moses is defining that he is just a human being. When we think that God has a unique connection to us as an individual, that we are therefore above other human beings because we know one aspect of God that others don't know, then we begin to blur the boundary of what it means to be a human being. Of course, God is a powerful presence, and there's ways for all of us to connect to God. But once we think that we are the only one who has this pathway, that leads to a pathway of arrogance. And similarly, you can look at the small aleph in a different way, which has a similar message, which is it wasn't that Moses humbled himself, but the aleph stands for Elohim. And it was God who made God's self smaller so that humanity could have a space in this world. And in this definition, personhood is created because of the humility of God. If God was everywhere and God did everything, there wouldn't be there wouldn't be space for us as people to make choices. So the first lesson of Vayikra, the first idea I think the rabbis want us to see, is realize our boundaries as human beings. That the idea of being a person is something that has limitations. And as a result of these limitations, we have to make good choices because we are in partnership with a larger world. The second element of Vayikra has to deal with power. Ibn Ezra, a medieval commentator, really struggles with this book because he's trying to explain why are there going to be sacrifices, and who's doing sacrifices, and how do I have to justify the divine? How can I justify the divine authority of a book that deals with these archaic practices? And Ibn Ezra says, sacrifices are there to teach us of the power of sin. What is he getting at? When you do a sacrifice, they're a messy process, right? An animal, a life is taken, and the way that life is taken, the blood is spread, and it's very, very messy, and therefore you need to respond to make sure that you're very clean, and there's all these acts of cleanliness that are done afterwards. You think it's difficult for us to deal with Purell. The Kohanim had to wash, then wash again, and then bathe. It was complicated. But the reason why is because sacrifice is messy, and so is sin. It gets everywhere. And what does that mean? We are the people who have the power to sin. Animals cannot sin. Only we can sin. And sin is a messy business. Why? Because it gets everywhere. We don't need to look any other further than the sin of using bad words, gossip, or speaking negatively about someone. The rabbis tell that story about you say one thing to one person and then it extends everywhere. You don't know where that message will stop. We think that a coronavirus germ is contagious. What about the contagion of gossip? So we learn from Ibn Ezra of the power of our own words, of the power of sin, and we are the people that can sin, and therefore we should be mindful of our own power. And I think that's an important message for us, that in order to realize that we need to be humble, we have to realize just how powerful we are. In fact, it's the times when we feel weakest, when the times that we are in denial of our power, that we are most likely to act with arrogance and hurt others. Therefore, the rabbis want us to learn Leviticus so that we could be mindful of the power that each and every one of us contain. And lastly, Sforno describes why was Moses called Vayikra? Because in Exodus, God says that when my cloud has descended, you must stay away. It's dangerous for you. And therefore, Leviticus begins with Vayikra, Moses being called, because God is telling Moses, okay, now you can come forward. Think about this. Moses loved God. Moses wanted to see God. Moses spent extra time on the mountain, struggled to come down from the mountain just because it was wonderful to be with God. And then God says, you need a break. And wait for me to call upon you. There's a message here of taking pause, not rushing out to those things that we like to do and those things that draw us, that attract us. It's important to pause. Interesting. Aren't we all waiting? Aren't we in a state of pause as we wait for the government to tell us it's okay to go outside and embrace that unknown? Of course, we can go to the grocery store, but those moments when we come together, we're waiting. And therefore, we have a moment of pause. It requires humility to wait for that call. I think there's also an appreciation that we have to have of the gift of pause, that sometimes we can appreciate the cloud more by waiting outside as opposed to rushing in. And if we utilize this time of pause to appreciate all the things that we can return to, then when we do, maybe we'll be even more appreciative and we'll develop those relationships in a more meaningful way than if we just rushed back very, very quickly. So Vayikra comes in and gives us a pathway for humility that hopefully, if we take advantage of, we can avoid the tragedy of Noah. And I want to end with that. We are not reliving the story of Noah. The story of Noah is a tragedy, and one of the greatest tragedies is that there's only one ark. Today, there's millions of arks. In each and every one of our home, I want you to think about yourself as living in an ark. And therefore, while we're all floating in our individual arks amongst the ocean, let us appreciate these lessons of Leviticus with the people that we are dwelling amongst. And then the other message of Noah is that the water recedes after 40 days. Interesting. That might be the case for us. Let's see how it turns out. About 7 weeks, we will be returning to this world. And then our responsibility to maintain this world and to maintain the people in this world will return to us. Let's live with humility. Let's learn from Leviticus so that we can make this world a better place when the waters recede. Shabbat Shalom.